so that we have this for later. Cool. You cannot minimize Zoom while you're recording this meeting. Okay, I won't minimize it then. So I've got Maya open here, and the file that is in Google Drive for sharing should look something like this. All right, it's just the two hands, and I think they're actually separated at the moment, so it's two separate meshes.
I don't think I can see anything. Can anybody else see anything?
Oh. No, I attempted to do this and then got distracted. Okay, so there are two hands. They're still separated meshes, and that's kind of where the file starts. Is that what people saw in general? Or actually, let me take a quick poll. Who opened the file over the weekend and got to mess around and do some stuff in Maya and try things out? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so actually a fair amount of people. That's good. Nice. Is this, and I know a lot of people said they had actually Maya experience. Before I launch into anything, does anybody have any specific notes or points that they want to make sure that I hit during the class? So go ahead.
I have a question. So yeah. I started to rig up the joints, and I got to like the painting, but I was a little bit confused. How do you know what orientation the joints are at?
Okay, thank you. Yep. So joint orientation, we will definitely cover that today. If you ever want to see what direction anything is faced, a really quick and easy way is to just hit W, which activates your move tool, and then make sure over here on the right, you've got a couple options for like what's going on. If you click your tool settings and axis orientation, you can flip back and forth between world and object. So if I leave it on world, let me show you what I mean. So if I move this like that, and then I go back to the move tool, it's still pointing that direction because this tool is oriented to the world. If I flip it over to object, now it's saying what orientation the object has. So it's just a quick and easy way of seeing what direction your objects are facing. The joints can sometimes be, it's a little more important to see what's going on with them all the time. So there's actually these joints are very, very tiny. Let me go ahead and modify their size here. All right, so right now you can kind of get a little bit of an idea what direction they're facing using the same trick where you just make sure that it's set to object. And each time you select a joint, it'll show you. So if I rotated this joint like that, and then I selected it, you can see that now it's pointing that way. Another thing you can do is actually come into display, animation, and where are you? Ugh. It's orientation, joint orientation, show. Oh no, I've been put on the spot and now I'm failing. Joint labels, lattice.
So in the end, you like want all the joints to be facing in the same direction as the finger, like towards the fingernail?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, that's a good kind of way of thinking about it. Really what you're paying attention to is your mesh. So because this hand is actually kind of pre-laid out for you, when you are putting the joints in this hand, they're running down the finger. And so your joints in the end, you want to be all pointing at the next joint. So when you're making your joint chain, you wouldn't want them to be kind of crooked like this as you go down your finger. You want them all to be in a line, like nice and straight. And then the next thing that you want to check and make sure is that your joint is pointing at the next joint. So for example, if you had placed your joints and then you moved this one like that, this joint is no longer pointing at that joint because you just translated this joint versus rotating this one into position by selecting the previous joint and going like that. So now this joint is actually pointing at that joint. And I guess the final step that you want to do with your joint layout is to make sure that your joints have no rotation before you attach to the skin. So I just rotated this joint to get this thing to be here. Before I attached it to the skin, what I'd want to do is freeze transformations on this joint. And what that will do is make all the rotations set back to 0. So if I come into modify, freeze transformations, make sure that these are all active and hit apply. Now you can see that all 3 of these are set back to 0, which is good because your bind pose or whatever pose you attach your character to your joints, all your joints should be at 0 rotation. It just makes your life way easier. So cool, excellent, good first question. Does that answer?
Were you trying to do display, transform display, local rotation axis?
Yes. So that's display. Let me bring that back. Okay, so display. Next, object display? No.
No, transform display? Transform display.
Transform display.
Are you in rigging? I don't know if that helps or not helps.
No, it definitely makes a big difference. All right, so display. Oh, yeah, transform display. Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Gil. So there's this thing called local rotation axes. And so when you turn that on, you can actually see the little XYZs will stay there even when you're not selected on it. So if you were to have rotated your joint, you can see that now your joint is pointing that way. And you can always toggle it back off by just making sure it's selected. Go to display, transform display, local rotation X. That's often a nice step to do before you attach. You can select your entire hierarchy, do a local display, make sure that there's no oddball pointing some random direction before you attach. Cool.
I have 2 quick questions. The first one is, so in your example, you showed like if you want the joints all pointing to the next one. But let's say like I've already kind of put my joints in my hand and I want to move the orientation of one that's kind of like in the middle, but I don't want to like move the joints that follow it. Is there a way where you can just change the orientation of one joint like individually where it doesn't affect the ones that come after it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. So off the top of my head, I would say that there are kind of 2 ways to accomplish that. So one way would be, so let's say this one got accidentally put over here. This joint got put back in position. Now this joint, you want to point to that joint, but you don't want to affect this one because maybe it was set up correctly. So it's pointing out the end and it's good to go. Is that kind of a good setup for what you're talking about?
Yeah, like if you were wanting to change the orientation. Yeah, that one.
Okay, cool. So
without affecting them.
There are 2 ways that you could do that. One way would be to use the Orient Joints tool, which is underneath of skeleton. And then it's here, Orient Joint. And what you do is you can select how it will reorient each one of these joints. So this is actually something that runs over top of the entire joint chain, but that's actually not a bad thing because it makes all the joints behave in the exact same way. I would not use orient joint to world for this situation. You would want them to orient to each other. So the primary axis, what this means is what axis is going to be pointing at the next joint. By default, that's the x-axis. It usually looks like the red handle. I tend to use that a lot. The reason to know what's going on here is some game engines or maybe some other rigs will have an axis of orientation that they prefer. I've never had any problem with X. I think sometimes Unreal uses Z, which it would be easy to fix that. You would just say point with Z versus point with X. But for this, I'll go ahead and leave it at default. So the joint chain, the red axis will, or the X axis will point at the next joint. The secondary axis is the one that will be pointing up. And so usually I use Y. In general, that is the axis that most programs recognize as up and down. So you want to then also make sure that these two options are activated so that when you hit apply, it will kind of align them all uniformly. So if you take a look at how this is now, if you select the root joint and then hit apply, see how it flipped that. So now that's pointing that way. Maybe that's not actually what I want. I want the secondary axis world orientation to not be X. I want it to be Y. So now the Y is pointing up. So this one's pointing at that one, this one's pointing at that one's pointing there, this one's pointing at that one, and this one's pointing out to nothing. So that would be one way, using the orient joint tool, making sure your primary axis is set to X, secondary and secondary world options are both set to Y. The other way you could do it, okay, so if this is like that, what you could do is just select joint and hit freeze transformations, or actually, sorry, select this joint, unparent it from this one, because what you would want is to keep this in the exact same place, but you need to rotate this to be correct. So you can unparent, no, it no longer is connected, and either eyeball it, so you can just rotate using the rotate tool, which is the hotkey for that is E. So you can do that, or you can select rotate over here for those of you new to mine. So that's rotate, and that's move, and that's scale. The hotkeys for that.
Press to unparent?
Shift and P. Yes, thank you for. They're kind of just in my fingers. So if I'm doing something and you're like, what? Just please ask. So thank you. Shift P means unparent. You can also select it, and where is parent and unparent? I don't know that I've ever actually done unparent through the menu. So we'll just say Shift P for now. So now that this one is unparented, you can either eyeball it and aim it like that, or another method you could do is use an aim constraint. So say this is in kind of a weird place, so it's just slightly off like that. It's kind of hard to line that up. So what you can do is select the joint that you want it to aim at first, hold shift and select the second joint second, and come up and put kind of a temporary constraint on it to aim it. So there's actually a thing called aim constraint. Hit the options box. And it's kind of similar to the orient joint where you want your aim to be X. 1 means it's on and 0 means it's off. So now what it's going to do is it's going to aim this thing, the x-axis, and the up vector is going to be y. So when you hit that, it'll point it directly at the other joint, and then you would need to come in to the hierarchy and just go ahead and get rid of that. And so it'll leave it pointing at that joint. then you can reparent and freeze transformations, and then you're back to where you need to go. So that's the other method you could use. You can either use the orient joint tool, or you can kind of manually decouple things, point it where you want it to go, and then reattach it. I've had to use, in general, I'll use the orient joint tool, but I have had to do this process manually sometimes because the orient joint tool will either be confused or just think that it should aim it this way because that's what it wants to do. The joint where that would usually happen would be, for example, if I had put in, oops, I put in my joints for fingers like this, right? The wrist doesn't really know where to point because it is got 4 children, so it doesn't know which child to point to. So sometimes I would have to manually go in and make sure that I point this thing just either by dragging it around and then freezing transformations and then reparenting all the stuff, so that when I rotate the wrist, it's actually rotating kind of along this nice axis, right? Because you don't want it to be set up like this for rotating, because then you're kind of doing weird things to try and get your wrist to rotate, if that makes sense.
What did you press Shift P to reparent too?
Just P. So P is parent and Shift P is unparent. And the yeah, thank you. So the order of selection matters with parenting. So you can actually parent a lot of things all at the same time. The thing that will be the parent is the last thing in your selection. So if I have all these cubes and I've held Shift and selected all of them, the last thing that I select by holding Shift will actually be the parent. So if I hold Shift, hit P, then you can see that all my cubes are now underneath of this last one. So if I move it, it moves all the cubes. Does that make sense? Yes, no? Okay. Cool. So I went ahead and set up a kind of a completed hand that I'll go ahead and add into the shared files at the end of class, so you guys can pick through it and kind of look at one way of doing things. So if this is what you get to in the end, I would say this is a good success. With all things in art, there's no one right way to do things. This is simply one way that I'm doing it. I will say, for a general rule of thumb, if you look at your hierarchy and when you're done rigging and you have 12 things over here, that's going to be a hard way to work in the end, because your Maya scene is going to get very busy and it's going to be really hard to see what is going on if you don't have it organized nicely. So here is one suggestion for how to organize any rig for your future. In general, there's underneath of a group, a master group, which can just start out as an empty group. And you can make an empty group by going create empty group. And what that does is it just basically makes a hollow thing right at the middle of the world. There's nothing in it. All it is basically a container that has a location. So this tends to be where I start. And so I'd call it something. And then I'd put everything in that bucket. So this is where I have all the stuff that is made up of my rig. The first thing that's in my rig is usually my joints. So here's all my joints. And I would just go ahead and select the root, which is this thing. Select the empty container and then parent it. So now it's in the bucket. You can also just drag things around holding middle mouse click in your outliner, and you can parent things that way too, if you want. So I'll go ahead and put that back at the top. The next thing is some way of organizing all your mesh objects. This thing actually only has a single mesh, so I went ahead and combined my hands by selecting one, holding shift, selecting the other, and then going. So I'll go ahead and run through that process real quick so you can see. Okay, so this is more what it started out, where you had 1 and 2 separate. So if you ever want to combine meshes so that if you select one, it selects both, you select one, hold shift, select the other one, and then you can either go inside of the modeling drop down, go into mesh, combine, or if you like using buttons inside of the poly modeling one, this button is actually the combine. So you can just click it. If you've got them both selected, go like this. And now you can see that if there's only one poly surface. So if I select one, it selects both of them. The important thing to note is when you've done that, it creates this stuff over here. So sometimes you'll hear me refer to something called history, or what is it called? Yeah, history or non-deformer history. Those would be the two important things for rigging. So history, Maya kind of records what's been going on with these objects as you've been working with them. And sometimes it's useful because you can, similar to a modifier stack in 3ds Max, you could go in and like change the number of subdivisions if you added in some kind of smoother or something like that. But in general, what it does, I think, is just save it for undoing. Like if you hit Z, you can undo, or Control Z or Command Z. If you are confident in your combining of these two things, you can also see that it left behind these two groups. These are not necessary anymore. If you select your mesh and you delete history by either going into Edit, Delete by Type History, or you can click the little button here, which is History. You'll see that those two groups went away. And now inside of your shapes, you no longer have those little inputs. So I just undid what I just showed you. So here is kind of a representation of your history on your object. And what that will end up doing is if you have 10 objects and they all have 30 history states, Maya will really start to get sluggish. So every so often, if you're confident that this is how you want your object to be, you can just delete your history. And that will get rid of a bunch of things that Maya is trying to keep track of in its memory, and it'll start to run fast again. So that could be one lever to pull if you're noticing that Maya is slowing down as you start to work with things or keep modeling. You may need to go into some of your objects and delete the history. Cool. So the reason that I wanted to combine these is because the operation that I'm going to be doing is skinning. And skinning, you can actually do symmetrical operations. So you can do something on one side and have it affect the other side. Where that is for skinning is you can say mirror skin weights, and you can pick one side to copy to the other. So if you've spent an hour and a half skinning one hand, you can actually copy the skin weights if they are combined over to the other hand by just making sure that you're picking from the right direction. By default, I believe that your positive side is on your right and your negative side is on your left. If you ever want to check that, an easy way is to just make a primitive and move it left and right and see what happens. So actually, okay. So this is the negative side. You can see that because it's -1. This is the positive side. So when you're picking your mirror operation, what you can do is say, copy across the Y and Z. So that means that's actually wrong. I believe you would want, no, I think that is right. So you would, Y is the up and down, and Z would be the direction you're going. So you might have to flip back and forth to find the right one, but I'm pretty confident Y and Z is it. And you're going to copy from positive to negative, would mean that this is your divider. You're copying from this side to this side, right? And if you wanted to flip that because you actually painted weights on the other side, you would just uncheck that box, and then it would copy weights from this side to this side. If you copy them and you're like, oh no, I copied completely blank weights from one side to the other, you could just undo it and check the box and try it again. Cool. So with this rig, there's only one mesh, so I actually don't have a group. Sometimes if it's a more complicated character and there's like a head is separate from the body is separated from boots, and like maybe it's a dwarf warrior or something like that, so he's a shield and different things. I'd usually have a group like this, it's called Geo, and I would put all my meshes inside of Geo as a way of organizing them. The final thing is a single container for where all your controls will be located. So this is just a container group for all your controls. It's kind of like folders is how you can think of how I'm using these groups. But if I open up controls, you can see that at the highest level, you have your wrist controls, this one, and this one. And then also this master control. So if I were to select the master control, it actually moves everything. In general, I would recommend that this is kind of where you start. So if you were doing a bouncing ball rig, you would probably only have a master, or you would definitely start with a master controller. So that would move everything. With this is moving the joint root and both wrist controls. So in essence, it moves the entire character wherever you need it to go. It's nice to have that because maybe you've set up your scene or somebody else has modeled an environment for you, and where you need your hand isn't at world space 000. So instead of kind of hand placing individual elements, sometimes it's really nice to just be able to rotate everything into position. And now this is where you're starting from. So your controls are still at 000, like your wrist controls are still nice and zeroed out. So this is now your kind of your reference point.
I have a question about the freeze transformation stuff. When I was doing my hands, I forgot to freeze transformation on the joints before I binded the skin. And then after I bound the skin, it said that I couldn't freeze. And so now I'm like stuck with like weird numbers. Is there any way to fix that?
Yes. So it's a little bit, I guess there would be two ways. One way, I guess, is a little bit safer for, well, no, they're both very safe. One way would be, I guess, a little bit easier so that you're not having to work with a new tool, but I'll go ahead and show you both. The way that might be fastest would be to go ahead and select the root joint of whatever your skeleton is, duplicate it by hitting Control D or Command D, and then you get an entire duplicate of your joint chain. Just for working purposes, I'm going to unparent it from the hand rig, so now it exists outside. So you can see that this is a duplicate. And then I would go ahead and duplicate my hands by hitting Control D or Command D, and then unparent that as well. So now I basically have a duplicate of everything that I've done so far. The hands, if they are skinned, you'll notice that all these things are grayed out. And all that is kind of an artifact from the other mesh. All you have to do is unlock those. You can unlock them by highlighting all of those, by clicking and then just kind of dragging down. Press right click and go to unlock selected. And what that does is it will unlock all of your channels again. So if you wanted to move your hand, you could. And I'd recommend you do that if you've kind of duplicated your mesh. So you're starting from scratch here at this point. I'm going to go ahead and hide my old hand rig by hitting Control H. So now all I can see is my new hand rig. So at this point, you can basically fix all your joint orientations that you have problems with. So, use the orient joint tool, manually rotate, hit freeze transformations, do all that good stuff. Make sure that each joint is pointing down the line to the next joint. Once you've done that, the final step is you can use copy skin weights. So you can go ahead, select your joints, select your new mesh, do your skinning operation just like you did last time. So now you have some probably garbage default skin weights. Oh, I think I have mine set up to, yeah. I was experimenting with some different stuff to see if it would be good to recommend anything. I think just doing the default skinning operation is the way to go to start out. So go ahead, select your mesh, select your joints, define skin. Then you should have some default joints, which it doesn't look like it does. Let me double check that it is. Oh, right. I think I've switched this to, yeah. So make sure this is joint hierarchy so that it adds in all the joints. That was my problem. Skin unbind.
Hey Kirby,
Okay.
you keep closing it and you're not hitting apply.
What's that?
You keep closing out your window, but you didn't hit apply. Don't you have to hit apply for that to work?
To get it to bind?
Yeah, when you were going to your skin and doing that last command,
Uh-huh.
you hit close, but you didn't hit apply. Does it automatically apply?
Oh, I did? Okay. If I hit close, then that's not
why
good.
it's not working.
Why am I hitting the close? Oh, okay. Gotcha. Cool. Yeah, I don't know why I was having a brain fart. Go ahead and do that. Skin, bind skin. Okay. Huh. Oh, did I not? All right. Please ignore the quick clicking. Yeah, one thing that might end up happening, so thank you for noticing that. When I was closing, if I've changed an option to joint hierarchy, sometimes if you just close it instead of actually applying it, it won't save your change. So when I was going back and then quickly just going skin, bind skin, it still wasn't using my updated option. So thank you. Go ahead and attach these, skin, bind skin. Now, hopefully, yeah, so I got some garbage skin weights here. What you can do now is transfer over all of the hard work that you just did. So if I turn on my old hand rig, this thing, if you select your original combine, like your original mesh first, and then hold Control or Command if you're on Mac, and select your second mesh or your new mesh second, you can then go up to Skin, copy skin weights. And what that does is it looks for the closest vertex and it puts the paint information on that vertex. So because these meshes are exactly the same, this will actually work really well.
So when did you freeze the transform? I'm just confused, like when I was supposed to freeze.
Okay,
So
yeah, it would have
been
before this. So this is not attached to the mesh, to my new mesh. This is when you would freeze your transformations. This is when you would fix any joint problems, when your skin is not attached to your joints. So at this point, if I were to, for whatever reason, want that joint to be there and make sure that this thing is pointed at that, I could come up to my rigging, skeleton, orient joints, go like that. Maybe that's how I want it. This is when I would reattach the skin. And then after that, you would copy skin joints. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So that would be one method for doing like copying over a lot of your weight. I use that all the time. And in fact, this is a really nice way of saving some work for future stuff. If you have a human character and maybe you're making, a ton of characters for a game. But this character has a jacket, this character has jeans, this character has sneakers. What you can do as a jumping off point for skin weights is just kind of have a neutral body that you've spent a bunch of time like painting really good skin weights on. And when you attach a new skin that maybe has a jacket and some sneakers, you can copy over the weights from the kind of neutral body to your new fancy one. And that's a really good jumping off point because it'll fix a lot of issues. Hips are usually really tricky. Shoulders are usually really tricky. And like your fingers sometimes are really tricky. So it can kind of get you really far down the road. And then all you have to go in and just go in and like fix one or two problem areas after that. So.
Does the freezing stuff, like, does it matter if it's not frozen, or will it just make your life really hard down the line?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you can go ahead, and that's exactly right. You can rig it, it will work. You can animate it, but it will make things not run as smoothly down the line. The reason that I'm saying this is because this happened to me. So when my first job that I got was, I think after I had been in school for a year. And those first rigs that I made on my first year on the job, I'm having to work with now, which is like 11 years later. Those rigs are a hot garbage pile of they're not very good. And specifically in the hands and like the waist, I've got all these weird joint orients. And so when I'm like, I want to make a fist, what I want to do is be able to grab all the controls and just rotate on one axis and it'll go like that to make it faster. But all my fingers are pointed weird directions, so it does weird stuff. So I have to go in and hand rotate each joint carefully to get it in the right place. You can get there eventually. It's just a real pain in the butt. Cool. So thank you. Those are excellent questions. So we've covered two of the things that I wanted to mention, which is orienting joints and mirroring your weights.
I actually had two more questions about the paint weights thing.
Sure.
Is there a way, so once you're painting weights, it doesn't seem like there's a way to, like, if you've accidentally painted too much, is there like a erase?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good question. Thank you for bringing that up. So skinning, the way that you attach, so what you're talking about is the bind method. So if I come in here to my tool and I go ahead and say paint skin weights, you'll notice that I think the default operation is called interactive. And so what that means is that each vertex has to add up to 1 in the amount of influence that is on that joint. So if you are here in paint mode and then I go to, oh, come on, paint mode, select influence. Okay, so you can see here the wrist, white would represent that those verts have an influence of 1 from the wrist. So it adds up to 1, so it's good to go. So what you're talking about is, okay, I've come in here and I'm on my add operation. I've got this set to something really small, 0.05, so I can very carefully kind of push things into position, right? So if I've rotated this thumb and I'm coming in to fix some of these verts to see what's going on. Got my paint tool active, and I just start gently going like this to click on the individual verts and add some influence. I'm like, ah, crap, I actually don't want any influence on those. You can zero them out by doing replace and setting the value to 0. And what that will do is hard set it back to 0. But keep in mind that those weights have to go somewhere, because according to Maya, something has to be influencing those verts once it's bound. So unless you tell it where to go, Maya's going to do its best guess. And I have had situations where, so I just set those verts back to 0. It might add that influence to the fingertip over here. So then when I move the fingertip, it moves those little verts over here for some reason. That's just Maya's best guess as to where to go. So in general, what I would recommend is you don't really work in the subtractive way. You're always adding. So if you wanted to set those back to 0 for this joint, or sorry, for the wrist joint, what you would want to do is find whatever joint you do want it to influence 100%, select that joint and paint 100% to that joint, because then you are saying, hey, Maya, use this joint to influence these verts. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. And so that's specifically for the interactive workflow, where it's a zero-sum operation. It always adds up to 1. There's no way to do any kind of different things. There is a different bind method, which is called post. And I have seen some people work in this method. It's a little weird to think about, but you basically, each joint gets a 0 to 1 as you're working, if that makes sense. So you could come in with this workflow and say, I want 0 influence, on this joint, and paint with the 0, like paint with the replace on 0. And then you go into the next one, you're like, this one's gonna have like 0.5, and this joint's gonna have like 0.6. And then once you're all done, Maya kind of adds everything up and then still redistributes it to be 0 to 1. So it's kind of weird to think about, where it's keeping track of, okay, you said no real influence here, some influence here, this joint, some influence, and it kind of puts it all together, and it does it afterwards. So it lets you work in that subtractive way, but in the end, you're still getting this operation where something has to be influencing a vert. If you do choose to work with that workflow, that's totally fine. I just started working with the interactive workflow from when I started doing like skinning and painting weight, so I'm very familiar with it. So it makes more sense to me. It's more intuitive for me to work in this like 0 to 1 manner versus this like cumulative and then redistribute, which is the post method.
Well, how do you change the brush size again?
Yes, if you're hovered over your mesh, you should see the marker. If you hold B and then drag left and right, you can resize it. If you've hovered over your mesh, here, sometimes this is what happens. If you hover over your mesh and it looks like that, that probably means that your brush is enormous. So a little faster way to work than holding B and like doing like this, where you're like, am I doing anything? You just zoom way out until you can see the borders of your brush, then hold B and go like that. Then you can kind of actually see what's going on.
Okay.
When I was painting during my practice, I would I needed to erase a little too because it got on like the wrong finger, and I used shift. Like, I don't know if that, I was like shift painting and it was erasing. So I don't know if
so yeah,
that's gonna cause problems.
No, it's not actually erasing. What it's doing is smoothing. So it's blurring it, and it might look like it was fixing it because you're kind of minimizing the influence that it currently has. So it looks like it's pushing it back in place, but what it's doing is smoothing. So when you hold shift, that's just kind of the hotkey for switching over into smooth mode. And what it does then is if you have two influences, so one vert is being influenced by the wrist and it's being influenced by the pointer. When you hold shift, it'll try and do its best to smooth out kind of the deformation between those two deformers. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay. So I can actually do it here. So it might look like when I hold shift and I start to do that, yeah, things are moving ever so slightly and the colors are changing. But what it's doing is it's trying to smooth out what the mesh looks like, because if I had actually really strong, so here, if I go ahead and just paint some random influence on this vert. Oh. Right, so now this vert is randomly being influenced 100% by this joint. If I hold shift and kind of drag over top, it's kind of hard because it gets pointy. Let's see how it kind of looks like it's fixing it. It's basically trying to smooth out that weird, like it pushed way out into what the shape of the hand isn't. And so Maya is trying to keep the shape of the hand as well as it can by smoothing out between those two influences. And eventually you kind of get there, but really you probably wouldn't want any influence on those. So what you would want to do in this case, if you have this random vert poking out like that, you would want to find whatever thing, whatever joint you want to influence this 100% or 70% or whatever, which maybe is this joint. Activate it and repaint the influence onto that vert. So it moves back into place, and now it's actually being actively influenced by the right thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
Cool.
And then I just had one more question. Towards the end of the lecture from last class, you were saying to kind of like smooth out like the ends of where your joint's affecting your mesh. And for some reason, for one of mine, like I think because I used the edge tool instead of like painting the influence.
Okay.
And when I was trying to smooth out like one of the ends, it just like the influence just stopped on where one of the edges was, and it wouldn't. I can also just like email you later if.
Yeah, no, I think I know what's happening there. So sometimes if you have been flipping back and forth between paint and select, what can happen is you'll leave a component selected. So if you're in select mode and you're like edge, and you've added some influence this way, and then you flip back to paint mode, I believe what Maya says is you can still only affect that selection. So it's kind of locked. You aren't able to paint influence until you kind of deselect stuff. So you would want to go back into your skin weights tool, make sure that you're in select mode, go to edge, and then click away so that nothing is selected. Now you can work with those verts again with any other joint. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, great. So that was a little bit about skinning. Are there other things that I wanted to mention?
Kirby, could you answer me this? I have my bones all set up, the skeleton, with the controllers that you were talking about putting on. So, you know, just the circles, and freezing the transformations when they're like at 90-degree perpendicular to your. So I've done all that and I've snapped them to the centers. However, when I go to move them and I'm using the controllers, it works when I move and rotate the controller. But when I go to move the base controller, it leaves the other two that extend. So do I need to parent those somehow? Mm-hmm. And then do I need to parent them to the skeleton mm-hmm. and connect them?
Well,
I'm a little, I don't know that process.
Yeah. That's kind of the next step. So that's awesome that you've already gotten there. But yeah, so what you're describing is basically creating your control hierarchy. So if you look inside of the way this is set up, so here's the right wrist, got the right wrist control group, and then inside of that, you've got the actual spline control. And I'll go over kind of why I set it up with groups inside of groups in just a second. But what you're talking about is basically, so here's all my finger controls, and all of them are children of my right wrist control. So when I move my right wrist, it moves all the children along with it. And then in addition to that, you would create little hierarchies for each one of the fingers, where both of these controls are children of this. So when you rotate your first controller, it rotates controllers 2 and 3. And then when you rotate your second controller, it rotates controller 3 as well. And then when you rotate your last controller, it only rotates itself. So I believe is that what you're, okay, cool. Yeah, we're gonna cover that in a second. What I'm hoping is we're also going to introduce one of the most powerful kind of methods or skills that you can develop as a rigger for within Maya, which is using some of the MEL scripting capabilities. So if you hear coding and that makes you break into fever sweats, don't worry, it's not that intense. We're not going to go over with this first one any kind of formal coding techniques. It's very much going to be something which is procedural coding, which if you were to ever take a coding class, one activity that you might do if you were, you know, maybe in middle school or high school is somebody would be like, hey, I'm a computer, tell me how to make a sandwich. And there would be like a loaf of bread and a peanut butter jar and a knife. And you would have to yell out instructions and that person would have to make the sandwich. And it's always fun because somebody's like, put the peanut butter on the bread. Is like, how you do it. So the person like reached for the bread and tears open the bag and the bread explodes everywhere because a computer does everything in steps. So the first step is open the bag. You have to open the bag, take out one piece of bread, take out one piece of bread. So why that's really cool for here is if you're doing something like making a control. So for example, here's a control. This is actually made of quite a few pieces. If I look at my hierarchy, you can see that this thumb control is inside of 2 groups. It's also got a strange axis orientation. It's small. And it's also named the same as everything here in this group. So if I were to recreate this thumb control from scratch each time for each finger, that's kind of annoying. And that's where you can come in with some scripting stuff and really save a ton of time. So to make something from scratch like this, you could go here, go create, empty group. So here's my starting point. Say thumb example group. Oh, whoops, I'm typing in the wrong place. Thumb example group. So that's my starting point. And then come over here to NURBS curves. Just make a starting NURBS curve. Shrink it down so that I'm like, oh, I think this is about the right size. Then freeze transformations. Boink. So now everything's set back to 0. I'll go ahead and hide my hand so it's not distracting. Put the NURBS inside of the group by hitting parent. Now it's inside of here, and then maybe add one more group by hitting Control G, and that puts the spline inside of here. Then I really need to rename this thing to be the right name. All right, so all this is very boring, but it's basically just showing it's a lot of steps just to get to that first thing. So what we can do is I'll run through some examples of how you can copy and paste things to save a bunch of time. And to find out what Maya is doing under the hood, usually it's represented down here. So if you click this little button down here in the bottom right, it's the gray one, it'll bring up your script editor. And this window is kind of all the steps that have been happening in Maya as you've been working. So I'll kind of shrink this over a little bit. Let me get back to here. Okay, so this is the middle of the world. So if I were to make an empty group, come up here, create empty group, you can see create empty group popped up right there. And then if I were to double click on that group and say thumb, you can see rename null1 to thumb, right? And then if I were to, so at this point, what you can do is copy those 3 steps up here to your shelf. So if you highlight all 3 of them, you click the middle mouse button and you drag, you can just put it up there and you say, save it as Mel. So now, at any point, I could just hit this button and it makes a group called thumb with 1 button click. So you can keep adding steps to that. So if I instead started with the circle, I shrunk it down to be generally the right size. That, and I renamed it to thumb1. Hit enter. The hotkey for putting something inside of a group is to just hit Control G. So I could put 2 groups around this control by just having it selected. Copy, paste, call this K group. I'll explain what this is in a second. And then call this Z group. All right, cool. So all of these have been saved. So at this point, I could come up here. This is where it started. I made a circle, and these are the parameters that got passed in by default to the circle. So if I middle mouse drag up here, say Mel, and at any point you can also delete the stuff that you've been putting up there so you don't get a ton of, random things. So all that work that I just did made this, but I just saved it. So all of these are generated perfectly. Okay, so this is where we're starting. Is it making sense what's happening? That these steps happen in Maya, and I'm able to drag those up as procedural steps and just say, hey, Maya, do all these right in a row. Is that good? Thumbs up. Awesome. Cool. Okay, so the reason that I'm naming these 2 groups these things, and the reason that I would recommend in general making your controls with this scheme is this. When you reposition your controller, what you want is for when you select your control that everything is still zeroed, right? Everything is at 0 and everything's at 1. And if you want to reposition in the world, that's what I use this group for. So I actually will select the group to move the control into place. So if you've got your top level group selected, then you activate the move tool by hitting W, and then you hold V. You can snap to joints. So you can snap your controller over here to this joint here. I'll hide that. So this controller has been moved, but it's still all at 0 because all that transform information is contained on your Z group. And that's my naming convention for why I call it zero group. So I use that to keep the controller at 0. Okay. And then inside of 0 group, I have this thing, which I'll use for something that happens later on. Here in this command, you can see the fruits of the labor. So I've got these things I mentioned called a macro, which is controlling lots of things all with one controller. So I've got these two custom attributes called splay fingers and curl fingers. If I select splay fingers and I go like that, you can see all 4 fingers splaying like that. And what that's doing is these controllers here on the pointer finger, like the root joint, they're set up just with the Z group and the K group. And what I've done is added in some control on this group. That's what this color means. It has some set driven keys is what those are. And so each one of the K groups for all these controllers are being activated by this single control. So even though those fingers are splayed, this controller is still set to 0. So the reason that's powerful is then you can easily layer some of this animation where you're like, oh, I want my starting point for my hand to kind of have, I don't want all my fingers to be, set like a knife edge chop, like I'm trying to poke somebody's throat out. I want it to be maybe a little bit relaxed like that. So that's my starting point for all my animation, but I don't want rotations in there already. So now I can rotate these controls nice and independently from that. So that would be one of the reasons that you would want to set up these set driven keys or these macros, to add in that ability for layered animation or layered control over the positions. The other macro that I have is curl fingers. So it curls all 4 of them all at the same time. So you could set up, maybe a crunched or a fist much faster than having to go in and individually rotate 4 fingers all at once. All you have to do is go like that and then position your thumb where you want it. And realistically, you could actually set up your thumb to be part of that as well if you wanted to use the K groups of your thumb controls. Don't currently have any set driven keys, so I could add those into my macro as well, so that I could have a single control to activate a fist. So now to animate back and forth from this is just one control versus 15 individual controls. Does that make sense? Yes, no? Speak now. Okay.
Yes.
Cool. So that is why I recommend when you're making your controls that you set them up with this schema where you are layering in these groups so that you can have nice zeroed out controls from the start. And then you can also add in some set driven keys to controls and still have them be zeroed out for animation. Cool. So one thing that I think I have set up, and I'll walk through how I got there, is if I had no controls set up yet, this would be the step where, let's see, Chris was asking, or was asking about the controls. Who was asking about the controls just a second ago? Yeah, okay, cool. So if you wanted to get a controller right on top of this joint with a single button press, you could set up a Mel script to do so. And I actually think, let's see, I've got one that I made, and I've got a bunch of annotations, and I'll certainly share this at the end of class in case people want to use it. But I want to go through how I arrived at the end so that you can have some basis for stuff. So if I select a joint and then I activate the script, oh, I can't do that because I've already got something named that. Let's go ahead and make a couple new joints just so you can see what's going to go down here. All right, so let's call this test joint. All right, so I would want to make a controller for test joint. And what I would want is that controller to be named the same as my joint so that it can be different than the other controllers. I'd want it to be positioned in the right place. And I'd also want it to be inside of those two groups so that I can get going with constraints and set driven keys and all that good stuff. So if I select my joint and I activate my script, you can see that it made a controller right here. You can see that this controller is, it will rotate at the joint's position like that. And that it also is named for the joint. So this one is called test joint. Oh, and I actually violated my own naming convention. JNT. I think that's how I mentioned that I usually name joints in the past. So underscore JNT. And that'll come back into play here in a second. So if I name it with that convention and I hit that, now it's called test Z group, test K group, and test controller. And so all that happened with a single button press. I didn't have to construct it by hand. It got placed into position automatically. And it also, let's see, what's the final thing that it did? Oh yeah, it resized the control, or it resized the NURBS curve to be the size that I wanted.
So you don't have to have the controller inside the joint. You can have it hover like it is.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. You definitely don't want the controller underneath of the joint. So the controller is what's driving the joint. The joint should be both separate from the controller, but also it is 100% influenced by this controller. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is like I have my joint and then I have the controller circle like as a radius or diameter, circumference.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm saying is that yours are hovering above parallel and mine are perpendicular.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, thank you. That is a good note. So the important part about this, so I think I mentioned last class that a mesh has that transform object, which is like the bucket. And then inside of that bucket, you have the shape. So that shape could be a sphere, or that shape could be a cube, or whatever. But that's what's inside of here. So that's what's happening in this case too. So what you're talking about is that NURBS curve. And so inside of the transform bucket, you've got your NURBS curve. And your NURBS curve is shaped very much like this, where maybe it's a little smaller, but the pivot point is right in the middle of this transform, right? My NURBS curve is here, but the transform is lower. And the reason that I did that is so that I can have those little guys hovering above the hand, and maybe it's a little bit easier to select. This is purely a this is a decision I made as a rigger that I thought would help make it easier to work with. So the reason being, if I had this curve and I snap it into position, and size it appropriately, nope, darn it. There we go. Okay. So it's kind of a little tricky. Maybe I just felt like this, selecting this thing was maybe a little bit difficult once you start to stack. So here's another, oops. Here's the next controller. Say that's where the middle finger is. That's where the ring finger is. So it could be a little tricky to try and click them individually without them overlapping and trying to get things. So that was purely my way of getting around the fact that there's a lot of controls all packed tightly together. So there's nothing wrong with the way that you're doing it. The reason that my pivot point is in this different place is I've modified the spline using this method, where what you can do, so just like polygons, you can edit a spline by right-clicking it and saying Control Vertex. And that'll show you each one of the little control points for your spline. And you can edit these. And this doesn't affect that point that you're using to move it around in the world. So if I grabbed all of them and I moved it up, and then I went back to object mode, which allows you to select the transform, it stayed there, right? So now when I rotate it, it rotates like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the height doesn't really matter. It's just, that's just preference. It's just arbitrary kind of. This is just, okay, great.
And I'll often modify the simple circle to get all my controls. So these wrist ones are just a little bit of a modified thing here, where all I did was activate the controls. I grabbed I grabbed these two and pulled them like that, so that it kind of forms around the mesh a little bit. And this giant controller is, let's see, go back to, there we go, is just a default one where I grabbed, get out of here, joints. So there's kind of a hierarchy in Maya of what it will pick. Joints are at the very top. So if you drag select over a joint, it'll always select a joint. It'll never do like components and things like that. So I've just grabbed those four corners and I kind of shrunk it in like that, and then grabbed the two outside points and scaled them out. So that's kind of how I got that big controller. The reason that I did that is to just make it look different than the other controllers, so it's easy at a glance to know what it is. Cool. All right. So let's walk through the steps for how I made this script that generates these controls, which are like naming sensitive. So you don't have to constantly, because it is a pain in the butt, double click, go to the right place, and then you'd be like pointer one. Ugh. I only want to go through that once when I'm naming my joints, and then everything else can just inherit from that. This is maybe this is the first actual coding concept that we will touch on, and that is a variable type. So you can think of a variable, kind of like how the transform, it's just a bucket. So you can put whatever you want into that bucket. And there are a couple different types of variables that are easy to work with and that actually are really important for Maya. So Maya does a lot of stuff with names. So a string is the type of variable that stores letters. An int is an integer, and that stores whole numbers. And a bool or a boolean is just a true-false statement. And that's kind of computer for 1 or a 0. So usually 1 is on and 0 is off. So that's a bool. But all we're working with here is strings. And so the way that you can know and store what is currently selected is here in this first line. So what I've done is I've made here string, and then the way that you have to write a variable is to start it with the money sign. So that's what that is. So I said string, then money sign, and then this is the name. OBJ, object, is usually what I do, but you could do whatever you want. And then this, oops, these two next things, I guess this is a little bit more coding stuff, but this is an array. So a variable can either be one thing or it can be a bunch of things. And so if you put these two symbols, you're telling the computer that this is going to be a bucket. There's going to be a lot of things in here. And so the reason that you do that is because what you're doing in the next set is you're saying what that variable is equal to. And so this is the operation in Maya that it's equal to. And this is the shorthand for what is a selection. So to walk through it once more, you have your name of your variable. Your variable is a bucket of stuff. And that bucket of stuff is whatever is selected. So in theory, you could have, you could have a couple spheres. So if I've held Shift Select, now my selection holds three things. So my variable needs to be able to be a bucket so it can hold all three of those things. And that's the only way that I know how to kind of activate that piece of information in Maya. It's always a bucket. It's never like one thing. So whenever you're using this trick, this is a line that you can just reuse for pretty much any code that you write in the future. If you're trying to find what is selected, what is currently selected, this is the line that you use. And then in the next step, what you're doing is you're trying to find a part of that name. And so if you think of the string as the full name, so here I've got a sphere, and that sphere is named hot sphere, right? So that's the name of the sphere. If I've selected that, I'll go ahead and make a new mel thing and start to walk through it. I've got string obj, so that's my variable name. Make sure that it's an array with those two things. And then that character is to the left of your one. So that's, I forget what the name of it is, but that basically is important for Maya because anything that you put in between of those two things can be a Maya command. So that could be make a sphere, that could be make a joint, that could be make a group, could be whatever. What we're doing here is we're looking at the current list, the current selection. That's what ls is. And then dash SL. So there's actually a bunch of operations that you can do underneath of this category, LS. And SL is look at the current selection. So one resource that you can use for looking at some of the other stuff that would be under there, if you type mel Maya ls, you can see that that's one of the first things that pops up. And then it'll always kind of, the top result is usually the one that you need. So you can see that this kind of gives you a good definition of what this is doing. So the synopsis of what the ls command is it returns the names of the objects in the scene. That's what this command does. And so you can look at, or you can look at specific names based on the flags. And so here, what I'm saying is what is selected. So there's all the objects in the scene, that's ls, and then SL is what is currently selected. And you can check if your code is working right. Usually, it's not a great editor. This is like a coding editor, but an easy way to check if you're down the right path is to just type print and then something. So what we're going to print is our variable. And then because it's an array, you still need to use those things. And because it's an array, you have to pick one thing out of that bucket to look at. And so in the middle, type 0. The reason that you type 0 is because it's a computer and computers start counting at 0. And so what this means is print object 1. Print the name of object 1 is what that line means. So if I were to hit this button up here, that'll run the code without getting rid of it. So you can see right here, hot sphere. Hot sphere is selected. Now it's not selected. If I run the code again, it doesn't print anything. If I were to duplicate the sphere, drag it over here, this is hot sphere 1. I run the code again, hot sphere 1. Select normal one, hot sphere. So if you are delving into the wild and woolly world of Maya coding, it's a good place to start. So the print operation, variable, and grabbing your selection is an excellent place to start, because now you can do tons of stuff with this small bit of information. What we're going to do is we're going to make a name, a new name, based on whatever is selected. The way that we're going to do that is using special Maya command. So this one was the list command. I believe that's what I just always know it as ls. The ls command. I don't know the full name of it, even though I use it all the time. This one is the substring command. So this basically can use a part of the name. The way that it works is you pass in a string that you want to only grab a part of. You say what letter you want to start at, and then what letter you want it to end at. So if I come back to my original example, and I make a new string, which is going to be my short name. Oftentimes when you're making variable names, I find it very useful to make the name like a brief description, just so I know what's going on in the code. So I say short string, and this is going to be one thing. So it's not going to be any of these brackets, right? It's just short name. And then I want to make sure to put in my 2 tick marks so I can put a command in here in the middle. And that's going to be the substring. And then you want to pass in a string that you want to carve up. obj 0, right? So it's the one thing that's selected. And then you start counting at character 1. And we'll just say go to the 5th character. And then instead of printing obj 0, now we'll see what happens when I print short name. So if I select sphere 2, we would expect it to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it should print HOT_S. So if I hit run, it indeed printed HOT_S. And this is really cool because now we have a name that we can attach to anything that we generate out of thin air. So if we make a new group, we can store that short name and put that as the first part of our short name, and then attach something at the end, which is exactly what we do. So here I make a circle. So this is the NURBS, or this is the command for making a NURBS curve, and you can actually just copy and paste that. You don't have to type it from scratch. What I'll do is usually just go like this, click the circle button, and then, oops, make sure nothing's selected first, then click the circle button. And then you have your NURB circle command. So if I copy that and paste it into here, go ahead and delete all my extra stuff. And I hit the run, it'll make a circle. And you can come in and start to customize how this circle is made. And you can mess around just here in the channel box to see what things will affect what over here. So the reason that the circle gets made flat on the world like that is because of these 3 numbers here. So it is based on the y-axis like that. If you were to switch that so that it's not using the y-axis, but it's instead using the z, go ahead and delete that, run it. Now it builds the circle facing that way. Or you can, do the final one, face it that way if you want. Oops. Oop, too many zeros. So now it faces it directly down the x-axis. Cool. And then the other options are like radius. So if I made this 0.1, the circle would be much smaller. Boom. So now it's a little tiny circle like that. And you can come in here and mess around with those parameters as a way of dialing in what you want your sphere to be before, instead of just continually running the code over and over and over again. So that's what this next step was here in this script. So making a circle. The one addition that I added was to give it a specific name. And the flag for naming stuff is always -n. And then you put whatever you want your name to be after that. So if I had my circle like that, and I wanted my circle to be named Kirby circle, like that. The reason that it's yellow is because I put it in between of these quote marks. And you always want to use quote marks when you're doing a name because it's looking for a string. And that's how you give it a string. You put it in between the quotes. So if I were to hit, so if I go ahead and run this, it should make a sphere with a 1 radius that's oriented on the Y named Kirby circle. Kirby circle. So this is how you can get by combining substring with the name, you can then get it to be named based on your joint. So if I, so that's why this is here. So I've got name root is that substring that I just ran through, where I basically grabbed a certain amount of characters. And I guess there's one last little bit of logic, one last little secret bit of sauce here. So the name of your joint might vary. So if you have joint 1 is pointer and joint 2 is ring, pointer is 6 letters long and ring is 4 letters long. So how do you only grab the right number of letters at the beginning so that you can give it the right name? You can look at the overall size of your string. And if you have a naming convention, you can use that to kind of work backwards. So the reason that I said I always make my joints like this, where I say, root underscore JNT, like that, is because now I know that if I count backwards from the full length of the string, if I count backwards 3 letters, it's always going to be whatever the name of the joint is, right? Because the last 3 characters are always JNT. So if I've got root joint and I've also got pointer, like that, it doesn't matter if I count backwards from the end of root or if I count backwards from the end of pointer, you're still going to get these characters all the way up until the underscore. And the logic for that is here, where you can say size. So this is an operation. So you can pass in a string and you can say, what is the size of this string? So if I go string name example equals Kirby. So I've just made a string and then the value of that string is Kirby. So if I said size and then passed in the variable name example, even though name example is really long, it's still looking for the value. So it should return 5. I think that's how long my name is. Yeah. And you can change that. So you could be like boobity 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 boo. 31. So it's going to count how long that thing is. So here, the logic that I did is I basically said inside of these parentheses, which is important, I said count the size of whatever's selected, right? So that's the first step. So I've got whatever the name is, and then I subtract 3. That's what that second part is. And I make sure that I put it inside of brackets, so it does the whole operation before it passes out the final value. That's what the parentheses do. So if I look at this substring command, it's doing a lot of things, all with this one little bit of code. I pass in the name of whatever's selected. I look at the whole length of the name of that thing. I count backwards from 3, or count back 3 letters, and then I store that value as the name root. So now I have the substring that I can use to populate all the rest of my stuff. So then when I make my circle, what I do is I pass in this stored value, and you can combine strings by using this formation where you put them inside of brackets. So if I said string, actually, here we go. So it's like Kirby plus underscore control. What it's going to come out with is combining these two things. So I say print name example, boom, Kirby control comes out the other end. So it's all one thing. So we've got circle, it's got a good name. And then these are a couple specialized commands that move that circle kind of up, but it leaves the little point of transform down at the bottom. This is way more just copying and pasting than previous ones. So this is, custom typing code. We're not copying and pasting these first 2 commands. We're doing a little bit of copying and pasting here where we've copied in and pasted just the default circle. But I added in this little bit at the beginning, which is to name the circle. Then the next step is directly copied and pasted from manipulating stuff. So what I did was I just made a default NURBS curve, right clicked, went to the control vertex. Oh man, hold on. Got to get rid of these joints. They're going to get in the way. There we go. Okay, so I highlighted the circle, did the control vertex, highlighted them all, shrank them down to some size that I thought would work, and moved them up a little bit to some location that I thought was a reasonable starting point. So now that I've done, and then I selected away, and that was it. So what I did here was just come into the little commands that came out, found the first thing, which is this NURBS circle, and I just copied those commands and I pasted. The one thing that I'm editing is I'm replacing the name of what is happening here. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that I select the control that I just made by just simply copying and pasting this into the different spots. So select this control, and then you can see here that it's a little bit of a funky change, or I'm actually, what this is doing, this is when I selected those control vertexes. That's what my commands for those are. So what I could do is actually paste here, make sure that I include this with the naming .cd, like that. So what, dang it. So what this will do is it will append the name root, or it'll combine the name root with this little string, and that'll end up selecting the control vertexes for our newly generated control. And then this moves them up in the world, and then, or sorry, this scales them in the world, and then this moves them in the world. And then this deselects everything. So that's how I got this next set of stuff that's happening. Then the final steps are the groups. And to generate the groups, I'm reusing my substring of the name, and I'm just using the mel command for making a group that's empty, which is pretty simple. You would just type, oops, group, and it'll turn that light blue color when it's actually a specific Maya thing. Then the name. So whatever you've named your variable, right? Plus, and then whatever you want this special group to be called. So the first group that I made, I think, was the Z group. Oops, not A group. Like that. So what that would do is it would make a group, pass in the name, and then make, and then append that little bit to the end. To make it an empty group, you just type -en, like that. So I don't have any variables here because it's a brand new thing. So what it's going to do is make a group called Z group and have it be empty. So if I hit that, you can see it made a Z group and there's nothing in it. So that's what these two lines are doing. They're just making empty groups with a specific name. And then these are the commands for creating that hierarchy that Chris is talking about, where I'm putting the control inside of the K group, and then I'm putting the K group inside of the Z group. So that's what these two lines do. Parent is the mel command for parenting something. So it does it in 2 steps, where if I had all my stuff, I'll go ahead and just make a, if I had that, boop, boop, like that. So if you imagine with me for a second, this was my procedurally generated circle. This is my first procedurally generated group. This is my second procedurally generated group. What the script is doing is it's putting the control inside of the second group. So it goes, whoop, parents it like that. So now that control is inside of the group. And then it parents the second group to the first group. So it would select this, like that, and then go like that. So what you'll end up with is this nested structure. Okay. And bear with me for just a couple more minutes, and then I'll take take questions if you guys have questions at this point, if you're liking what's going on. So the last thing is to reposition the control that you just made to the location of the joint. And how I'm doing that is I am making a temporary group, or sorry, a temporary constraint, and then using that to kind of snap it into position. So this is a trick that I use all the time, where if I just have a thing, so say this thing is pointed like, huh, oh, there we go. Okay, I don't know why I was. So say that joint is there, it's off to the side, it's pointing a weird direction, and I want to get this snapped over here. A really quick and easy way of doing that would be to select your joint first, hold control, and in your hierarchy, select whatever the group that you want to move. Second, come up to constrain with the options box. So this is a parent constraint. And so what this does is it will put all the values of the parent object into the child object. without necessarily nesting it in the hierarchy. So what we've been talking about here is a direct parent. So that means that in the hierarchy, it's actually underneath of it. This constraint, if you added a constraint, a parent constraint, you can see it didn't move this joint in the hierarchy. But if I were to rotate this joint, oh, sorry. If I were to rotate this, wait. Okay, yeah, sorry. So if I were to rotate the group, the joint would follow, even though they're not kind of directly parented under each other. And you know that they are because they have this little piece of information here, which is a parent constraint. And you can see kind of what target it is and stuff like that. Maybe a little bit too much information for the parent constraint to start out, but why this is pretty cool is because what I did the first time, just a second ago, is I said maintain offset. So that means I don't want anything to move anywhere. To reposition something, you can actually just uncheck that. So now when I create a parent constraint, it's going to snap whatever the child is to the exact location and exact rotation of the parent object. So if I were to select the joint first and then the group second, that would make the group the child. If I say maintain offset is turned off and I hit apply, snaps it directly there without me having to reposition anything. And then what you can do is just delete that constraint and it will stay in place. So that's the steps that you do. You basically create a temporary constraint, it snaps it into place, and then you delete that temporary constraint so that you're not having to like look at the exact XYZ of one thing, save those values, put them in this other thing. You're using Maya's special constraint thing to basically truncate the whole process. It makes it a little bit easier. Cool. So the commands for that, I'll put things back in place, are here. So parent constraint is the mel command for parent constraint. And what I want to do is pass in a name so that I know exactly what it's called so that I can delete it later. And the order is very important for a parent constraint. You want the thing that is being constrained to be the last name, and the thing that it's being constrained to be the first name. And it's always just two, right? So the thing that it's being constrained to is our very first variable. It's selection. We've selected that joint, we stored that value, so we have it for later, which is awesome. So that's the thing that we want it to go to. Then the second thing is all the stuff that we just made using mel script, specifically the Z group. So that's the high level group, the zero group, as I described, that's the thing that you use to put stuff in place, and all of its children will follow along with it. So that's why you want to have that high level Z group. So when you structure your command like this, you'll make a parent constraint that has a special name that has this relationship where whatever you selected will be where your new control goes to. And then in the very next breath, you basically just delete that temp constraint. So all you're left with is your nice clean control group structure, which has your Z group exactly where you want it to be, your K group, which is right underneath of it so that you can set up all your cool macros and whatever, and your control, which is underneath of everything. So everything's zeroed out. Everything is named correctly. Everything is named based on whatever your joint was. So you don't have to go through the really annoying process of renaming things 3 times and making sure that you don't do any typos. That's something that happens a lot. So I will pause there. That was a fire hose of information of a brand new thing, possibly to many of you. So please let me know what step wasn't clear, or if anything, if you're like, I don't care, I'm just gonna use the thing and never go back to it again. But please ask away. Or we can let it simmer and you can ask later. Okay.
It's a lot of information, and you might have already gone over this. But how do you, so you have a lot of different scripts happening. You can just like have as many scripts as you want, right?
Okay, so when I say a script is all the instructions all in a row. So you can think of a script as usually containing multiple instructions all in a row. So you can have as long as you want. Here's a script that I've been working on for a couple of years for work, which is 5,000 lines long. And it contains a lot of stuff. There's a lot of instructions, and it's a procedural rig generator. So I'm able to have a character put some points in space, press a button, and it automatically generates a specialized rig that we need for work. So there is no limit. So if that answers your question.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so these scripts saved separately from your like scene?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So if you have these instructions, so there are a couple ways you can store this information. One way was how I was showing you just a second ago, which is just putting a little temporary thing up here in your shelf. So in Maya, these are called shelves. And you can, so if you're in poly modeling, that's a default shelf that Maya comes with, and you wanted to customize it a little bit, you could highlight all this stuff, hold the middle mouse click, and go like that, and just drag it up top. And so that you can see it puts the little default icon up here. So now this is going to be saved in your shelf even after you close Maya, as long as you come over here to the little sprocket and say, save all shelves. Boom. So now those mel commands have been saved as a little button in your shelf. So that's way number one. So that's saving all your coding into a shelf. You can also export it out as just a mel file. I don't think we'll cover that today, because I think just making a button for, like, this is a short enough bit of instructions that you could probably just email it to yourself for future use, if that's how you wanted to keep track of that file. But we'll go over in the future more robust workflows of like saving a separate file, which is a mel file, and then putting it in a specific folder for your mel program, or for your Maya program, so that it will look at all your custom stuff and it'll like populate things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
And then, and I'm sorry if you already went over this, but how do you so you have all of these different ones, like Mel, Python, right up here, these like tabs on your script editor.
These guys?
Yeah, so those are all different scripts, right? And so then you've attached them to different aspects in your scene. Right?
No, so this is just an editor. So how to think of this? Well, no, I guess that's the way to think of it. This is just an editor. This isn't attached to anything. I can get rid of this by coming up here and saying delete tab. It's just a tab.
Okay.
And it just gets rid of it.
So you don't attach it, and well, I guess like how do you? That's the part that I'm confused on. Like how you implement like attaching the script to something, or like bringing it into your scene.
Gotcha. Yeah. So this, so the code editor, that's what these little buttons up here are for. So if I hit this double play button, it will just run whatever's in this window right now. If I were to hit this button, it will run it and I think clear it. So let me select this joint.
Okay.
That makes sense. And then it runs it and clears it.
Okay. It's just whatever tab you have selected when you press play.
Yeah. So in the future, what we'll do is, so that you don't have to always have this window open, I'll show you how to basically make a little custom button and store your script in a specific place so that Maya will go and look at that and then come back and run it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So with that being said, it's probably not the greatest idea to try to do this like today, because then you can't save your work, essentially, right?
Try
you can save it. I guess you can. But I mean, you can save it in your. Never mind. That was a dumb.
No, it's fine. Here, we can do a test. We'll copy that. Check this out. See if we can. Should just be able to. I just pasted in the chat all the stuff that I just made. So you should be able to copy that. And then come into, I'll reshare my screen. Start from, copy, command, delete tab. Okay, so then back in Maya, click this little button down here, which should bring up this window. I think by default, your window should, ooh, I need to keep this. I'm working on this right now. It'll just be one Python tab and one Mel tab. If you haven't ever opened up anything in the past, which is fine. Select your Mel tab, and you should just be able to paste in your code. Alternatively, you can hit the little plus button, which is next to whatever your last tab is. Click Mel, and then you can paste the code in there. Once it's like that, it should have all the colors and stuff. It should be nice and pretty. You can do one last step of highlighting it all, clicking and holding the middle mouse button, and then dragging it onto your shelf. Yeah.
Yeah, it works great.
Nice. So it's pretty easy to customize all this stuff. You can just right click your new little button and say edit. And on the shelves command, you can give it like a custom icon. You can give it a custom name. So like the tooltip, I'll call it like new control. Save all shelves. And so why that's kind of cool is, so in Maya, anything you hover over, they make it very discreet, I guess, so that it's not distracting. But down here in the left, bottom left, that'll show you whatever the functionality of whatever you're currently hovering over. So if I hover over the sphere, you can see it says polygon sphere, create a polygon sphere on the grid. So if you hover over your new little button, new control, because I just typed that in there. So if you don't have a custom icon, you could put a custom tooltip in there just to keep track of all the stuff if you're making a bunch of buttons. But yeah, I use that just kind of dragging functionality all the time because these shelves, sometimes the icons are good, sometimes the icons are not so just like helpful with knowing what's going on. So if you're clicking through and you're like, what the heck is that? You can just hover over it and it'll tell you create joint. Click and place joint on existing joint to add to skeleton, blah, 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 blah. So cool. Other questions? Going once, going twice. Okay, cool. So let's see, we've got 10 minutes. I think I could get through one last thing, which is the set-driven keys. So like I showed, I've got these two special controls on my wrist controller that allow me to splay the fingers with a single mouse drag, and also curl fingers with a single mouse drag. So I guess this is a good little tip for all things over here in the channel box. if you select an attribute and then you're over here, like we're in your workspace, and you click and hold the middle mouse button, that will animate that channel back and forth. So why, when I select this control and then I'm going like this, what I'm doing is clicking the middle mouse button and then dragging left and right to make this value go up and down. That's just how I'm doing that. Another way of doing it would be to left click over top of the value here, like where it says 0, and you can do that same operation. You can also just select and type 3, 8. You can hand type in things if you want to be really discreet about the number that you're putting in there. Just a little bit of functionality. Cool. So to add the 3 things that are important for this are: 1, adding a custom attribute, because that's what this is. Display fingers. I've added that to this control. By default, when I made my circle, it just had the normal things: translate, rotate, and scale. And so what I did to get it to this point was to hide a few of the attributes and then add a couple custom attributes. To hide attributes, it's much easier. You just select the control, highlight the things that you don't want to be able to change, right click and say lock and hide. Now you can no longer do those things. This is really useful if you have a control that you know for sure you only want to do one thing. So this, I'm like, I definitely don't want the person to be able to scale up and down. So even if they activate their scale tool, you can see that it's gray. You won't be able to. So you could also, if you only wanted them to be able to move, you could lock it and not hide it as a way of just like guarding against accidentally doing stuff. So now if I were to try and rotate, I can't. And you're like, okay, no, I really do actually want to rotate. You can always just highlight it and say unlock. Now you can do it again. Okay, so that's kind of modifying the basic attributes that are on anything. To add a new attribute, all you do is have it selected, come up here to edit inside of your channel box and say add attribute. And you can add a couple different types. These ones, the default ones, those are all floats, meaning that they're numbers that can be like smaller than 1. So it can be like 0.1 and whatever. So a float is a good place to start. I mean, it's a nice default thing. You can also have all of these other ones. We can cover that at a later date. For today, we're just going to stick with float. What you pass in at the beginning is the smallest it can ever be, the minimum, which I'll say is 0, and then the maximum, the biggest it can ever be. So I'll just say 10. Those are nice round numbers. And I'll call this test. Oops. Come up here to the name and say test underscore attribute. And so this underscore is important. So with pretty much any coding and stuff, you want to avoid spaces. Spaces create problems. So if you do want to have a separation in your name, use an underscore. It's much more useful. And Maya actually will recognize that underscore. And when it puts it over here in the channel box, it'll go ahead and add in a space. So if I said add, you can see the test attribute, which actually is test underscore attribute, automatically gets changed to test attribute just for when you're looking at it, so it doesn't look weird. So you can see here, I can left drag the value up and down, and I can also middle click in the scene and drag it left and right to increase or decrease the value. And I actually might go ahead and pause here. I think we're not going to be able to get through the whole set-driven key, so we can start up Wednesday with getting that set up. But hopefully, you guys have a good jumping off point for doing your skinning. Like, it sounds like a lot of you were able to get the project open. You've already done some paint weights. You've already even made, you've already generated the joints. You probably started orienting your joints. you've even started painting weights, and maybe you're even at the control stage. But hopefully these hints will allow you to get to the point now where you have the ability to select a joint, and if you were to move those joints, it would kind of deform the mesh in a nice way. And now you should be able to generate a bunch of controls if you wanted to use that script, or you could hand generate the controls. But you want all those controls to be in the right place so that when you rotate that control, it's going to be affecting the joint perfectly. So next class, what we'll do is go over how to attach the joint, attach the joint to the control. What we're going to use for that, and then making sure that all of your hierarchy is correct, so that if you select one of the higher level, one of the more senior controls, all of them follow, and then a junior control, the appropriate ones follow. Then we'll also go over set-driven keys so that we can make our first macro. And you can make as many of them as you want. Like you could even make individual controls for individual hand poses. So you could make a point, do painstaking set up your finger like this as a 0 to 1 or 0 to 10 or whatever. And then you could set up a thumbs up, and you could set up a Spider-Man web shooting hand position as specific attributes if you want it. Like you can go bananas with all these things. Really, what you think or how I think of these is how useful and how universal they're going to be. How much of something you're going to do over and over and over and over. And if you're going to do it a lot, you're going to save a ton of time if you make that thing easy. So if you're making a fist a whole bunch, it would probably benefit you to make a macro for making a fist, because you're going back and forth like this over and over. And if you have to position 16 controllers every time, that is a huge waste of time. So I'll leave it there. But I want to double check before I leave. Are there any very urgent questions or concerns that you would like to bring up before we close? Nope. Okay. And it's just.
Yeah, is that for this aid here or for next?
Oh. I guess one last shout out, H. I didn't forget about simulation stuff. I was actually thinking of something that you could do with your animation that would be somewhat simulation based. And so I was looking at maybe introducing next Monday something called Shatter, and then what the engine is in Unity, which is Bullet. And so how to combine that with Bullet to make it kind of seem like maybe the hand is karate chopping a brick in half and it like explodes everywhere. So you're kind of doing some procedural animation in conjunction with some hand keyed animation.
Sweet, sounds awesome.
Cool. Well, I hope you guys have a good rest of the day. Sorry we didn't get any kind of in-class time to work on your rig before 1 o'clock, but we're needing to really hit the ground running and cover a lot of concepts, which are going to, all of this stuff, like everything we covered today, you will use in all of the following projects. It's not going to be just a one and done type deal. Well, cool. You guys have a good day, and I will see you on Wednesday. Please email or ask for a quick Zoom chat if you have any questions.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Thanks, Kirby. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Yeah.